On a Monday morning in October of 2019, Kyle Brenner stood at the edge of his best cornfield and watched his entire year, his entire reputation, his entire net worth die a slow, silent death. The machine that was supposed to be his salvation, a John Deere S79O combine, sat gleaming under the pale Iowa sun like a monument to a failed god. It was a $500,000 paperweight. 3 days earlier, on Friday, it had been the thundering heart of his operation. A 543-horsepower beast chewing through 12 rows of corn at a pass, its massive grain tank filling with golden kernels every 11 minutes. Kyle, sitting in the climate-controlled cab, surrounded by touchscreens displaying yield data and GPS coordinates, had felt like a king surveying his empire. He was 34 years old. I had built a 4,000-acre corn and soybean operation from the 800 his father had left him, and this machine was the crown jewel of his success. It was a symbol that he had arrived, that he was smarter, faster, and more efficient than the old-timers who still farmed the way their grandfathers had. Then, with 1,200 acres of his best corn still in the field, it happened. A single, piercing alarm, followed by a cascade of error codes that flashed across the main screen like digital gibberish. Then, silence. The massive diesel engine shut down. The lights went out. The screens went black. Kyle tried a hard reboot, the same way you'd fix a frozen laptop. Nothing. He killed the main power, waited 10 minutes, and tried again. The screens flickered to life for a moment, displayed a cryptic message, CAN bus communication fault, primary controller offline, and died again. The silence that followed was louder than the engine had ever been. It was the sound of money burning, a winter storm, one of those early, wet snows that can flatten a cornfield and rot a crop in the ground, was forecast to hit in less than 72 hours. He had a 3-day window to save his harvest, and his state-of-the-art flagship was as useless as a boulder. His first call was to the dealership. Travis, their top field technician, a kid barely 25 with a degree in agricultural systems technology, was on site within 2 hours. He didn't bring a toolbox. He brought a ruggedized laptop and a briefcase full of diagnostic cables. He plugged into the combine's main port, and for the next 6 hours he stared at lines of code, ran diagnostics, and talked in low, frustrated tones to engineers in Moline, Illinois. The problem, he explained to Kyle, was buried deep in the machine's electronic soul. A control module, one of 24 that managed everything from engine timing to threshing speed, had failed. And because they were all networked together on a controller area network bus, the single failed module had paralyzed the entire system. It was like one bad bulb taking out the whole string of Christmas lights. I can't even tell you which module it is for sure, Travis had said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the autumn chill. The diagnostic software can't communicate with the main controller to find out. We'd have to start swapping them out one by one. Kyle's heart sank. So, get the parts. Get all of them. I'll pay for the overnight shipping. I don't care what it costs. Travis shook his head, and the look on his face was one of genuine pity. That's the thing, Kyle. We don't have them. Not all of them. There's a back order on the main ECU. Could be a week, maybe longer. A week. In a week, his corn would be under a foot of wet snow. The stalks would break, the ears would drop, and the moisture content would skyrocket. He'd lose 50, maybe 60 bushels to the acre. On 1,200 acres, that was a catastrophic, farm-ending loss. It was a figure well into the 6 digits. He spent the next day, Saturday, on the phone, calling every large operator he knew within a 100-mile radius, begging to rent a machine, borrow a machine, anything. But it was the peak of harvest. Every combine in the state was running from sunup to sundown. There were no spares. There were no favors to be had. His neighbors sympathized, but they had their own fields to finish, their own race against the same storm. By Sunday afternoon, Kyle Brenner had exhausted every modern solution. He had all the money, all the credit, all the connections a successful modern farmer could want, and none of it could solve his problem. He was powerless, a captain stranded on the deck of his technologically advanced, completely dead ship. He stood there at the edge of the field, the silence of the waiting corn pressing in on him, and felt a kind of despair he hadn't known since his first year farming, when a hailstorm had wiped him out. But this was worse. This wasn't an act of God. This was an act of technology. Let me tell you about Silas Hassel, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Silas was 88 years old and had farmed the same 160 acres his entire life. His land bordered the eastern edge of Kyle Brenner's massive operation. The Hassel family had homesteaded that quarter section in 1878, and it had never been owned by anyone else. Silas had been born in the same white farmhouse he still lived in, and he had taken over the farm from his father in 1955, the same year he married his wife, Eleanor. He had buried Eleanor in the churchyard down the road 7 years ago. He still farmed, not because he needed the money, but because it was like breathing. He planted 80 acres of corn and 80 acres of beans, the old-fashioned way, with equipment that was already considered dated when Kyle Brenner was born. From his front porch, Silas had a clear view of Kyle's field. He had seen the big green combine stop on Friday, that he had seen the little white service truck arrive and then leave hours later. He had seen Kyle pacing the turn row on Saturday, phone pressed to his ear. He saw him standing there on Sunday, just staring at the silent machine. Silas didn't need to hear the details. He knew the story. He had seen it play out a dozen times with the new generation of farmers. They bought machines that were more computer than tractor, and when the magic box of wires decided to quit, they were helpless. They knew how to operate, but they didn't know how to fix. Silas had been watching, not with judgment, but with a quiet, sad understanding. He knew about the storm coming. He could feel it in the ache in his left knee, a barometer more reliable than any weatherman. He knew what 1,200 acres of standing corn meant in the face of an early snow. It meant ruin. On Sunday afternoon, after watching Kyle finally slump into his pickup and drive away, Silas walked out to his main machine shed. It wasn't one of the modern steel pole barns. It was a great timber-framed hip-roof barn built by his grandfather in 1912, with a foundation of fieldstone pulled from the land by hand. The air inside was thick with the smell of old grease, cured wood, and dry earth. In the back corner, under a heavy canvas tarp gray with a half-century of dust, sat his secret. He pulled the tarp off, the fabric stiff and heavy. Underneath, the faded Persian orange paint of a 1948 Allis-Chalmers all-crop harvester, Model 60, seemed to glow in the dim light. It was a pull-behind unit, small and simple. It harvested 2 rows at a time, powered by a PTO shaft from the tractor that pulled it. His father had paid $950 for it brand new from the dealer in town, a full year's profit in those days. Silas had learned to harvest on this very machine, standing on the little platform, bagging the grain as it came off the auger. It wasn't a museum piece. Silas had used it every single year. He'd replaced the canvases, bearings, and belts over the decades, but the core of the machine, the solid steel frame, the simple cylinder, the shaker pans, was all original. There wasn't a single wire on it that wasn't for the simple taillight he'd added in the 60s. There was no computer, no sensor, no electronic module. Every part was moved by a belt, a chain, or a lever. If it broke, you could see the broken part. You could hold it in your hand. You could fix it with a wrench and a hammer. Silas ran a hand over the cool metal of the grain hopper. He checked the tension on the main drive belt. He took his grease gun and methodically worked his way around the machine, hitting every Zerk fitting, a ritual he knew by heart. Then he walked over to his tractor, a 1954 Allis-Chalmers WD-45, and checked the fluid levels. He climbed onto the steel seat, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. The engine turned over twice and barked to life with its distinctive rhythmic pop, 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 a sound that had largely vanished from the American countryside. He backed the tractor up, hitched it to the old harvester, and, with a quiet sense of purpose, pulled out of the barn and headed down his lane. He knew what he was about to do was foolish. He knew the young man would probably laugh at him, but he also knew the feeling of watching a storm roll in on a field that held your entire year's work. And that was a feeling no farmer should have to endure alone. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the story doesn't end there. Kyle Brenner had returned to the field late Sunday afternoon, drawn back by a morbid need to stare at his failure. He was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, contemplating the horrifying logistics of filing an insurance claim for weather-related crop loss, when he heard it. A faint, unfamiliar sound. Pop, 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 pop. It grew steadily louder, and he looked up to see a plume of dust coming down the long field lane that connected his property to the county road, and beyond it, Silas Hassel's farm. Emerging from the dust was a tractor so old it looked like it belonged in a parade, and behind it a piece of harvesting equipment so small and ancient it was comical. It was Silas, sitting upright on his old Allis-Chalmers, pulling that little orange harvester. Kyle stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. He thought it had to be a joke, some kind of strange senile gesture. As Silas pulled to a stop 20 feet away and shut off the tractor's engine, the sudden silence was broken by the sound of Kyle's two hired hands, who had been sitting in another truck, starting to laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh, not at first. It was a laugh of pure disbelief. "Jesus Christ, what is that thing?" one of them said, loud enough for Silas to hear. Kyle's frustration, which had been simmering for 3 days, boiled over into a bitter, cutting sarcasm. He hopped off his tailgate and walked towards the old man, a weary, condescending smile on his face. "Silas," he said, his voice dripping with forced patience. "What in the world are you doing? Bringing the museum out for a field trip?" Silas didn't smile back. He just looked at Kyle, his eyes a pale, clear blue that had seen 88 harvest seasons. He looked at the massive, dead John Deere, then back at Kyle. "Heard you were in a bind," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "Figured you could use a hand." Kyle let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a genuine, if cruel, sound. "A hand? Silas, that thing," he said, gesturing at the all-crop 60, "takes 2 rows. 2? My header is 60 feet wide. It takes 12. I have 1,200 acres to do before that snow hits on Wednesday. Your little toy there, it couldn't do 10 acres in that time." "It'll do more than that thing is doing," Silas said, nodding toward the silent green giant. The simplicity of the statement silenced Kyle for a moment. Silas climbed down slowly from his tractor, his joints stiff. He walked over to his little harvester and laid a wrinkled hand on the fender. "Your machine is too smart for its own good, son. It decided it didn't want to work, and there's nothing you can do about it. This one ain't smart at all. It just works. It's slow, I'll grant you that. But it doesn't quit. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known, with absolute certainty, that you could solve a problem that had stumped all the experts? Have you ever had to face the ridicule of people who believe that because your solution is old, it must be worthless? That is the moment Silas Hassel found himself in. He wasn't a proud man, but he had a quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of making things work. He understood the physics of his machine, and he knew its limits, and he knew its strengths. Kyle was still shaking his head, his smile gone, replaced by a look of sheer exasperation. "Silas, I appreciate the thought. I really do. But you don't understand. This isn't 1950. This is a business. We measure things in bushels per hour, and fuel efficiency, and return on investment. That thing is a liability. It'll probably break down in the first pass, and I'll have 2 broken combines in my field." "It won't break down," Silas said calmly. "And if it does, I can fix it. Right here. With these." He held up his hands, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin like tanned leather. "Your machine is run by ghosts in a box of wires. Mine is run by belts and grease and steel. I can't fix ghosts, but I can fix steel." The hired hands were openly snickering now. Kyle felt a flush of embarrassment. He was the boss, the modern marvel of farming, and here was this old man with his antique junk making a scene. But then he looked past Silas at the endless rows of corn standing under the darkening sky. He thought of the banknote. He thought of the storm. He had 0 options. This absurdity was an option. It was a terrible, laughable, infinitesimal option, but it was more than he had a minute ago. A wave of utter desperation washed over him. What did he have to lose? His pride? He was already humiliated. He let out a long, slow breath. "Fine," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Fine. Knock yourself out, harvest a row, but when it falls apart, you're hauling it out of here yourself. I'm not paying a recovery fee for a tractor that was built before my father was." Silas just nodded, a flicker of something, not triumph, but resolve, in his pale eyes. He climbed back onto his tractor seat without another word. Kyle walked back to his truck, crossed his arms, and prepared to watch the inevitable, pathetic failure. He was certain this whole spectacle would be over in 10 minutes. Let me tell you about the next 3 hours, because they're the reason this story is still being told. Silas didn't rush. He didn't try to show off. He drove his tractor and harvester to the corner of the field, climbed down, and began a slow, methodical preparation. He pulled out an old-fashioned oil can and lubricated the drive chains, wiping off the excess with a red cloth from his pocket. He checked the tension on the V-belts that drove the cylinder and the straw walkers, tightening one with a half-turn of a wrench. He adjusted the clearance on the shelling plate, not by looking at a gauge, but by listening to the sound it made as he turned the pulley by hand. Kyle and his crew watched this ritual, the smirk still lingering on their faces. It was like watching a blacksmith prepare his forge in an age of laser cutters. It was ancient, painstaking, and, to their modern eyes, completely inefficient. When he was satisfied, Silas climbed back into the seat. He throttled up the WD-45's engine, and its steady pop, pop, pop deepened into a determined bark. Then he pulled the long lever that engaged the PTO shaft. With a whir of belts and a clatter of chains, the 1948 Allis-Chalmers harvester came to life. And it wasn't the roar of a modern machine. It was a complex mechanical symphony of moving parts, a sound full of purpose and industry. Silas eased the clutch out, and the little orange machine, looking like a child's toy next to the dormant green behemoth, rolled into the first 2 rows of corn. The gathering chains grabbed the stalks, pulling them into the sickle bar. The stalks were cut and fed onto the rubberized canvas conveyor, which carried them up into the body of the machine. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. Kyle held his breath, waiting for the choke, the clog, the sound of a belt snapping or an engine dying under the load. Then it happened. A steady stream of golden corn kernels began to pour from the end of the clean grain auger into the harvester's small hopper. At the back, a spray of chopped up cobs, leaves, and stalks shot out from the spreader. It was working. It was actually working. Kyle's smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. He walked closer, his boots sinking into the soft soil. He watched the machine complete its first pass, turn around, and start on the next 2 rows. It was painfully slow. The little hopper would be full after just a quarter of a mile, but the work it was doing was flawless. He walked back to where the machine had started and looked at the ground. It was clean. He couldn't see a single kernel of corn that had been dropped or missed. He picked up a few of the cobs that had been ejected. They were stripped bare, every kernel removed. One of his hired hands, a young man named Dave, whistled softly. "Damn, I'll be damned." Kyle walked over to the harvester as Silas was finishing another pass, where he motioned for him to stop. Silas throttled the tractor down, and the harvester's mechanical chorus quieted to a murmur. Without a word, Kyle reached into the small grain hopper and scooped up a double handful of kernels. He let them run through his fingers. They were perfect, clean, whole, with almost no cracked pieces or trash. He looked at the sample in his hand, then back at his own multi-million-dollar operations flagship machine, the S79. Oh, for all its speed and power, always had a higher-than-average percentage of cracked kernels when he pushed it hard. This sample, this was better. That's when the last trace of Kyle's smirk vanished. His voice had lost some of its certainty. "How often do you have to unload that thing?" he asked. "Every 10 minutes or so," Silas said. "Need a grain cart." Kyle stood there for a long moment, and the math was still ridiculous. The sheer logistical inefficiency of it was staggering. But the facts were undeniable. Corn was coming out of the field. Good, clean corn. And it was being harvested by a machine built 3 years after the end of World War II, operated by a man who was nearing his 10th decade. He looked at his 2 hired hands, who were no longer laughing. They were watching the old man with a kind of baffled respect. "Dave," Kyle said, his voice quiet, "go get the grain cart and tractor. Park it on the headland. We'll unload him there." Dave nodded and ran off toward the trucks. Kyle looked at Silas, who was watching him with those impossibly patient eyes. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't gloat, he just waited. "Get back to it," Kyle said, and it wasn't an order. It was a concession. For the next 2 hours, the 3 of them, Kyle, Dave, and the other hand, Mike, watched as Silas Hassel and his ancient machine did the impossible. They fell into a rhythm. Silas would harvest, his little hopper would fill, and he'd drive to the end of the row where Dave was waiting with the grain cart. He'd unload, and without a word, go back for more. It was a slow, steady, relentless process. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field. The big John Deere was now just a dark silhouette, a tombstone for modern efficiency. The only sounds were the steady pop, pop, pop of the old tractor and the mechanical hum of the harvester. The John Deere S790 hadn't moved an inch, but the field was shrinking, 2 rows at a time. Kyle stood apart from the others, watching the methodical progress. He was no longer thinking about bushels per hour. He was watching a philosophy in action. It was a philosophy of patience, of simplicity, of durability. The old machine wasn't designed to be fast. It was designed to work. It was designed to be understood. It was designed to endure. And as the last light of day faded and the floodlights on the grain cart tractor flickered on, illuminating the small tireless orange machine moving through the darkness, Kyle Brenner went pale. His arms, which had been crossed in defiance, dropped to his sides. He finally understood. He hadn't been mocking an old man with a piece of junk. He had been mocking a kind of wisdom he hadn't even known existed. And that wisdom was now saving his farm. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end with the last row of corn. They worked through the night. Kyle and his crew took turns in the grain cart, hauling the corn to the bins, a task made tedious by the small frequent loads from Silas's harvester. Silas never stopped. He sat on that iron tractor seat for hours on end, a thermos of coffee his only companion, his movements economical and precise. Sometime after midnight, Kyle climbed up onto the little platform on the harvester, shouting over the noise. "Silas, let me take over for a while. You need to rest." Silas just shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "This machine and we understand each other. Best if I stay with her." They worked that way for 2 straight days and nights. A small army of neighbors, having heard the story, started showing up. Not with combines, none were available, but with food, with fuel, with thermoses of hot coffee and words of encouragement. Or they'd stand at the edge of the field, watching the impossible spectacle under the portable light towers Kyle had rented. It became a community event, a vigil. They weren't just watching a field get harvested, they were watching a legend being born. By Tuesday evening, just as the first cold spits of rain began to fall, Silas Hassel finished the last 2 rows of the 120 acres that were most vulnerable. It wasn't the whole 1,200 acres Kyle had left, but it was the best of it, the highest yielding ground that represented the core of his profit for the year. The rest could wait for a thaw. The farm was saved. The next morning, the storm arrived in earnest, a miserable, blowing mix of rain and sleet. Kyle drove his pickup down the muddy lane to Silas's farmhouse. He found the old man in his barn, not resting, but meticulously cleaning the all-crop harvester. He was wiping grease and chaff from the chains with a rag, his movements as careful as a surgeon cleaning his instruments. Kyle stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Silas." The old man looked up, his face etched with fatigue but his eyes clear. "Morning, Kyle." "I came to pay you," Kyle said, pulling a checkbook from his jacket. "I don't even know how to calculate it. Custom rate, fuel, your time, whatever you think is fair, I'll write the check." Silas put his rag down and shook his head. "Won't take your money. I have to pay you, Silas. You saved me. You saved my entire year." "No," Silas said, his voice firm but kind. "You know the rule. Neighbors help neighbors. When my barn burned in '78, your daddy was the first one here with a crew to help rebuild. Oh, he didn't send a bill. Some things are more important than money." Kyle felt a lump form in his throat. He put the checkbook away. He stood there, a successful, modern businessman, feeling like a small boy in the presence of a giant. "Why?" he asked, the question encompassing everything. "Why do you keep this old stuff? Why go to all the trouble?" Silas picked up his rag and went back to cleaning a sprocket, his hands moving with practiced familiarity. "People like you look at this machine and you see something that's slow, obsolete, inefficient, but you're looking at it the wrong way." He stopped and looked Kyle in the eye. "Expensive doesn't mean better. New doesn't mean smarter. That big green machine of yours, it's built to be fast. It's built to be comfortable. It's built to make the company money on parts you can't fix. This one," he patted the harvester's orange fender, "this one was built to finish. It was built to last a lifetime. It was built for a man to understand. There's a difference." Kyle Brenner was a different man after that harvest. He didn't sell his high-tech equipment, but his relationship with it changed. He spent that winter in his shop with the service manuals, learning the guts of his machines. He bought an older, simpler 1980s-era tractor as a backup, a machine with more steel than plastic, more levers than buttons. He and Silas became friends. Kyle would stop by the old farmhouse once a week, and they'd sit on the porch, Silas talking about the old ways, about how farming was about the soil and the seasons, not just the balance sheet. When Silas finally passed away 2 years later at the age of 90, the church was overflowing. Kyle Brenner was one of the pallbearers, and he spoke about how an old man with an even older machine had taught him the most important lesson of his life. "Let me tell you one last thing, because the story keeps going. It's 2034 now, 15 years after that memorable harvest." Kyle Brenner is 49 years old, his hair showing streaks of gray. His own son, Ben, is 24, fresh out of agricultural college with a degree in precision farming and data analytics. They're standing in a field of soybeans, arguing about a fleet of autonomous, solar-powered weeding drones that have all stopped working because of a mandatory, over-the-air firmware update that has a bug. Ben is on his tablet, trying to troubleshoot with a support agent in another country. "They said a patch will be pushed out in 48 hours, Dad. There's nothing we can do." Kyle looks at his son, at the frustration and helplessness on his face, and he sees a perfect echo of himself from years ago. He doesn't get angry. He just smiles a sad, knowing smile. He walks back to the main machine shed and disappears inside. A few minutes later, Ben hears a familiar, rhythmic sound he remembers from his childhood. Pop, 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 pop. Kyle emerges from the barn, driving a beautifully restored 1954 Allis-Chalmers WD-45. And behind it, he's pulling a small 2-row cultivator. He pulls up next to his son. Ben just stares. "What are you going to do with that? It'll take us a month to weed this field." Kyle Brenner looks at his son, the tablet in his hand, the disabled drone sitting silently in the field. He looks out at the rows of soybeans and he thinks of Silas Hassel. "Let me tell you about a man who farmed this land a long time ago," he says. "He taught me that some problems don't need more technology. They just need a different way of thinking." That 1948 Allis-Chalmers All-Crop 60 still sits in the back of the Hassel family barn. Silas's grandson, a young man who works as an engineer in Des Moines, comes back 3 times a year to service it. He starts it up, lets it run for an hour, and greases every fitting, just like his grandfather taught him. The dealers and the experts say it's a piece of junk, a worthless relic taking up space. But the family keeps it, clean and ready, because they know that some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built in the first.